Thank you for joining us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. It has been said that the Paris Agreement on climate change demonstrates that historic multilateral breakthroughs involving every country in the world are possible. But the hard work of meeting the goals of that ambitious agreement requires political perseverance and expertise. We've seen this year in, year out during the Conference of the Parties. Agreement or lack of it on a word, phrase or figure can disrupt days or weeks of negotiations. There have been calls for reforms, especially in the science-based meeting to address the climate crisis. Recently, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was in Nigeria. We had a conversation that focused on this, as well as finance and the new climate action plan for Nigeria. Do stay with us.
Gaveling and trying to ignore parties from speaking does not behove the UNFCCC system, and we would want you to hear us and also hear our objections to this adoption. We absolutely object to this unfair means followed for adoption.
You expect us to have ambitious NDCs. The NCQG was supposed to enable us to have realistic finance goals. $300 billion is unrealistic.
Condemnation from both Nigeria and India after the COP29 text was adopted. This came after an exhausting 2 weeks of negotiations fraught with geopolitical divide and 2 days after the conference was scheduled to end, but the closing plenaries postponed twice. The last hours of COP29 was not different from many before it. This period could be very draining, that some get visibly emotional, as seen in Glasgow in 2021.
Delegates, I apologize for the way this process has unfolded, and I am deeply sorry. I also understand the deep disappointment. But I think, as you have noted, it's also vital that we protect this package.
The COP26 president said afterwards that he had not slept for 3 days before the negotiations concluded, with last-minute changes on the wording about coal. Stories of frustrated, exhausted and sad negotiators after every COP is very common. Despite the science being clear about the climate impact, political leaders' reactions have been as varied as their geopolitical locations. However, the United Nations Framework Convention Secretariat need to bring the parties back to the negotiating table every year, urging them to fashion a way out in spite of their differences.
The impacts of climate change on not only my own home, but vulnerable communities around the world, coming here to Nigeria, seeing the impacts again firsthand. I have the privilege in this role as Executive Secretary to visit many countries and seeing the impacts. And when I see how that impacts ordinary people, communities, families, businesses, it's heartbreaking. But that gives me the perspective and the energy in terms of what can be very, very frustrating within the negotiating process, which to many, especially those who are on the front lines of climate change, that see these negotiations that take place on an annual basis over 2-3 weeks as very abstract and sometimes question the purpose of that. But I go into these in my role as a custodian of the process, as a facilitator supporting the close to 200 countries that are part of this intergovernmental process. I said I'm always driven by, however exhausting, however frustrating, what it is we're actually trying to achieve, which is to address the climate crisis, but more importantly, have a positive impact on ordinary people the world over and nature. So that's what drives me and keeps me very, very focused. And when we look at, as frustrating as this process is, significant progress has been made over the past 10 years since the signing of the Paris Agreement. Before Paris, we were on track for a 5-degree increase in global warming, which would be a death sentence for the whole of humanity. We're currently down to just below 3 degrees, which is still far below the 1.5 degrees we need to be in order to create a sustainable planet for all of us. We will see at the end of this year, when countries come back with the actions they're committing to through their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, what actions are taken, and collectively what that means to that global effort, and where we are in going from 5 degrees to 3 degrees, and how much closer to 2 and 1.5 degrees where we need to be.
The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was set up in 1992 to support the global response to climate change. Multilateral negotiations under the UNFCCC have resulted in 2 near-universal agreements: the Kyoto Protocol done in 1997 and the Paris Agreement in 2015. Under the Paris Agreement, countries are obliged to record their emissions and submit reduction targets every 5 years, with the next round of goals due to be presented before the end of the year and in advance of the COP30 climate conference taking place in Brazil in November 2025. But over the years, many have asked if the UNFCCC is fit for purpose. During the last COP in Baku, Azerbaijan, leading scientists and other climate experts published an open letter in which they said the framework alone is not enough to solve the climate problems.
Ultimately, it's for parties to decide. It is a process that they own, and we as custodians can provide guidance. We will be working with an expert group throughout the course of this year with suggestions as to how the process could evolve. And this being Paris plus 10 years after the Paris Agreement, I think is a perfect opportunity for us to reflect and then look forward and to see how the process can evolve in a way that maintains that party-driven process philosophy, but looks at how the quality of decision-making, the speed of decision-making can be improved so that it is more reflective of the urgency of the action that needs to be taken.
The latest State of the Global Climate Report 2024 by the World Meteorological Organization confirms 2024 as the hottest year since records began 175 years ago, with a global mean temperature of 1.55 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, surpassing the critical warming thresholds of 1.5 degrees Celsius for the first time. While a single year above 1.5 degrees Celsius doesn't break the Paris Agreement's long-term goals, a long-term average below 1.5 degrees Celsius, scientists say it is a stark warning of the urgent need for emissions reduction. Multiple climate indicators also set new records. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations are at their highest in 800,000 years. And the oceans continue to warm at an unprecedented rate. Meanwhile, the United States' withdrawal from the Paris Agreement removed the country's obligation under the accord to reduce its emissions. Former President Joe Biden's administration put forward the United States Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, as the targets are known in December 2024. It has been reported they outlined commitments to reduce net emissions between 61 and 66% by 2035, compared to 2005 levels. During President Trump's first administration, more than 4,000 officials, including governors, city mayors, and business leaders from across the United States, pledged to uphold the country's commitment under the Paris Agreement through the We Are Still In coalition. Now, in his second term, the administration is reported to have blocked its officials and scientists from attending international climate meetings in recent weeks, including that of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the body that recently failed to reach an agreement on a timeline for the publication of its 7th assessment cycle report. Following President Trump's victory in the 2024 election, some leaders renewed vows to continue with emissions reductions as part of the United States Climate Alliance, which says its aim is to work towards a net zero future. While the United States may be the world's second biggest greenhouse gas emitter, it had almost always blocked the demands of developing countries. It had historically objected to the Kyoto Protocol's higher emissions targets, ensured that loss and damage funds were not linked to liability and compensation, and has consistently rejected ambitious climate commitments. However, the United Nations climate chief calls for calm as he encouraged countries to prepare stronger national climate plans this year.
What we need to avoid is a two-track transition path, where you have developed countries who have the means, have the resources to invest and manage their own transition, versus those of developing countries who are reliant on external sources to be able for them to partake in the transition. Last year we saw somewhere in the region of $2 trillion invested in the transition. But those facts show that only a fraction of that went to developing and emerging countries. So how that is rebalanced is going to be absolutely critical. Leaving Baku last year with COP29 with a new framework for climate finance, there is that opportunity, whether it's the delivery of the 300 billion, a tripling of commitments from developed countries, from external sources to support developing countries. And then, of course, the roadmap that needs to be fleshed out this year to get us on course for 1.3 trillion investment per year. So the opportunity to rebalance and ensure the needs of developing countries are more adequately served is what is presented to parties.
I invite parties to turn to Agenda 14, conclusion of the session.
Countries set a new collective quantified goal on climate finance in Baku, Azerbaijan in 2024. This calls on all actors to work together to scale up financing to developing countries for climate action from all public and private sources to at least $1.3 trillion per year by 2035. It sets a goal of at least $300 billion per year by 2035 for developing countries' climate action. This money is to come from a wide variety of sources, including public and private, bilateral and multilateral, as well as alternative sources, with developed countries taking the lead. However, climate change presents global crisis that disproportionately impacts developing countries like Nigeria. Less than a year ago, large areas of the country faced critical humanitarian challenges, leading to multiple deaths, widespread public health issues, food shortages, and significant internal displacement. Experts lament that local communities endure the daily consequences of climate change and do not have the luxury of time to wait for international support.
One thing that has come out from that visit is very clearly the need to engage the private sector in co-creating the nationally determined contributions for the country. The private sector, as it were, has been doing a lot of activities that is geared towards assisting Nigeria in implementing and meeting up our obligations. But however, they have never been part of the co-creation of this document, the 2015 document, the 2021 document. And, you know, it was a really eye-opening session where we had a meeting with the private sector and, of course, the Innovation Hub. And so it presents, it showcases that opportunities that is there and what Nigeria will be leveraging on to ensure that we really do have a whole of government, a whole of society approach, and of course, a whole of economy in producing an investable, bankable legacy.
During his visit to the country, the UN climate chief said a strong new climate plan that will supercharge Nigeria's economy is urgently needed. Already, the country is facing a severe cost of living crisis after the removal of fuel subsidy, among other economic decisions. In Nigeria, desertification in the north, floods in the center, pollution and erosion on the coast, and the associated socio-economic consequences all allude to the reality and grave impact of climate change. So the government says bold action to limit the impact of climate change must be undertaken urgently. At the same time, in light of rapidly rising population, accelerated development is needed to ensure improved living conditions of millions of Nigerians. The government intends to merge these two priorities, economic development and climate action, to achieve one of the world's first true just transitions. The Nigeria Energy Transition Plan is a homegrown, data-backed, multi-pronged strategy developed for the achievement of net zero emissions in terms of the nation's energy consumption.
We're not looking for loans. Again, you have to be able to drive mitigation. You have to be able to drive adaptation. Everything is financed, and that's where the private sector is very important. Of course, philanthropy, but philanthropic support can only go a little way. You have to be able to start being at the forefront of your story. Nigeria has what it takes. Nigeria is the giant of Africa. Nigeria is the biggest economy in Africa. Nigeria has the biggest population. You're talking about a youth population, a population of over 220 million people, and that is a huge market. You cannot talk about renewable energy market in Nigeria and you will not make a profit. Everything you put in the Nigerian market is profitable. So why can't we harness what we have? So you talk about, again, you're talking about the carbon market. Nigeria has the potential for that. Can we bring in private finance into capital intensive infrastructure? We're talking about using natural gas as our transition fuel. What about the infrastructure to drive this? Private sector. At the end of the day, you're talking, there are some technologies that can take methane from the air and give you hydrogen and graphite. Private sector. Can we have the right policies? Okay, private sector, give us feedback. Let us know what policies do you need in place for us to make it, to have that ecosystem where you can flourish and we're meeting our net zero commitments. We are also driving sustainable development.
In 2024, Nigeria submitted its new long-term low-emissions development strategy, which confirms the announced target to achieve net zero emissions by 2060. Nigeria faces a pressing need for substantial financial resources to implement effective mitigation and adaptation measures. Scaling climate finance to meet Nigeria's target is currently a daunting task.
One of the things that has come out is that we need to have an investable, bankable NDC. So if you look at the 2015 NDC and you look at the 2021 NDC, they speak to different obligations that Nigeria wants to have, but you don't see clear pipeline of projects. You don't see what is the role of the private sector in that document. Nigeria cannot submit that same kind of document. One of the good things I want to say is that Nigeria was one of the first countries to meet the BTR deadline, and I'm excited about that because, again, that is commitment. Very important is that the BTR provides a foundation for Nigeria in her NDC. So the leg room has been done. The leg work has been done. So Nigeria has done that extensive looking at the GHG emissions and everything else that would have sort of, if we had not done it, would have been problematic. But we have done the BTR and we have also done a national stock take. So there was a global stock take, and Nigeria, very ahead, was one of the countries that did her own national stock take. So you take the national stock take document, you take the BTR documents. I remember that we've also had our LT-LEDs. You take the LT-LEDs documents, and all these form a foundation. And again, you cannot forget the ETP, Energy Transition Plan. So these are primary resources that Nigeria already has to kickstart on her NDCs.
The Nigeria ETP set out a timeline and framework for the attainment of emissions reduction across 5 key sectors: power, cooking, oil and gas, transport, and industry. Within the scope of the ETP, about 65% of Nigeria's emissions are affected. Experts say while Nigeria's policies and action are consistent with a fair contribution to climate action, they do not put Nigeria on track to meet either of its targets.
The real question is the ones that have been there in NDC 1, 2.0, what have we achieved there? We need to really move from writing reports to satisfy international requirements to embedding action in all sectors of the economy in a much more proactive way. If you're still manufacturing nearly 93% of your energy from gas and 62% of your population don't have access, there is no widespread renewable energy program that you can point out. There is still ongoing massive flaring of gas. Millions of women across the country are still cooking with 3-piece firewood. Lake Chad is still dried up. More herdsmen are moving down south. Clashes are still all over the place. Of course, there are pockets of good news here and there, but by and large, we are lagging behind. So it's not about including more sectors. It's about making more progress.
In November 2021, Nigeria passed the Climate Change Act that seeks to achieve greenhouse gas emissions in line with carbon budgets, with green and sustainable growth by providing the framework to set a target to reach net zero between 2050 and 2070. With this regulatory framework, the Act established the National Council on Climate Change with the sole responsibility for the coordination and harmonization of national climate actions among several roles. While Nigeria's journey to net zero emissions had begun, it is already clear that the road will be rough.
We removed oil subsidy from fossil fuel nearly 2 years ago. A lot of money was saved as a result. Can you tell me exactly what that money has been put to use in order to justify the fact that this is partially a climate policy action? So what we would have done is to save all that money and then use that money strategically to invest in major renewable energy facilities across Nigeria. But I think what they have done is to just increase the allocation of FAC to various states. And of course, nothing necessarily wrong in that, but there could have been a small proviso that this is not just to increase budgetary allocation, but to increase allocations that are tied to certain climate projects, okay? So there is money. There is money also at the international stage, but you have to put your house in order. Appoint the people that know how to get the money, set your house in order, and then you can attract this funding.
Meanwhile, Nigeria has expressed its desire to host 2027's COP32 in Lagos. COP hosting rights rotate between the United Nations 5 geographic blocks, with COP32 being Africa's turn 5 years after COP27 in Egypt. Nigeria is the first country to officially declare its interest in hosting the summit.
COP is a big event. It's a global event. It is really up there in terms of the big events of the year. So if Nigeria is looking to host it, it must realize that it cannot be business as usual. When we're hosting things here, planning even small meetings, you hear things like money hasn't been released till last minute. So if you're going to bring 30,000 people, international organizations, top-class people, or to Nigeria for a 2 weeks event, you had better be prepared. So while on the one hand, it is something of a joy, of a pride that Nigeria is aspiring to host this event, I am really worried whether we have what it takes in terms of organizational capacity and arrangement to pull off a very successful event. I do hope it happens, but I have my doubts and worry.
African countries will jointly decide which country to put forward to host COP32, with their decision likely to be made at COP30 in Brazil this November.
That's our show for the week. Thank you for watching our inbox Earthfile at channelstv.com. It's available for all your comments and questions. And you can also view this episode and every other episodes of the program by visiting our YouTube channel, youtube.com/channelsweb. Do click the playlist menu and then click Earthfile. From me, Ayola Kasim, and the Earthfile crew here in Lagos, it's bye for now.